HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last of Its Kind, The Search for the Great Auk and the Discovery of Extinction, by Gisli Palsson, read by Paul Woodson. The great auk may be described, for it is little known to people, and nature has deprived it of that which it has bestowed on other birds, that is to say, wings. Yet it flies with its wings in the sea as swiftly as flying birds in the air. Guðni Sigurðsson, 1714 to 1780, 1770 Geirfowl Books, 1858. We should regard every living being as a going-on in the world. Thus, whether we are speaking of human or other animals, they are at any moment what they have become, and what they have become depends on whom they are with. Tim Ingold, born 1948, Imagining for Real, 2022. I call this era of man-made mass death a time of double death. It is not that the whole biosphere is overtaken with death, but rather that death continues to pile up. Renewal and resilience cannot keep the pace. Deborah Bird Rose, 1946 to 2018. Shimmer, 2022. Preface. The Lost Bird. The great auk displayed in the Natural History Museum of Denmark stands erect on its pedestal, its great beak jutting forward, apparently fearless. It is possessed of a certain dignity and grace. It demands my attention. It was probably killed off Iceland, where I come from, and was one of the last of its kind. For thousands of years, this large flightless bird swam the extensive waters of the North Atlantic, and made its nests on islands and skerries, where each pair laid and incubated a single, uniquely patterned egg per year. According to most accounts, the last of the great auks, Pinguinus impennis, were slaughtered on Elte, an island off Iceland's southwest coast, in June 1844. About 80 taxidermic examples of great auks exist in museum collections, and most of them came from Elte. Alongside the great auk displayed in Copenhagen are 4 large glass jars. One is labeled Iceland, 1844, male. These jars contain the viscera of great auks killed on that famous, or infamous, expedition to Elte. These are not all the bird's organs. Some are stored in another 7 jars elsewhere in the museum, out of the public eye, along with another stuffed great auk. At my request, a museum guide takes me to see this second bird. It is posed somewhat differently than the one on display. Its beak is open, as if ready to address the visitor. Unlike the first bird's stark black and white plumage, this one looks grayish and rather dull. I am told it is a true rarity. It is in winter plumage, while most great auks were captured when breeding in early summer. Perhaps this second bird was caged alive and slaughtered in winter. Perhaps it was kept as a pet for some months, like a great auk owned by the Danish polymath Ole Worm, 1588 to 1654, one of the leading figures of the Renaissance in the Nordic world. Worm personally owned 3 great auks, one of which he sometimes walked on a leash, and he made a fine drawing of it before adding it, stuffed, to his Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, a precursor to the modern museum. In its imposing old building in Copenhagen, only a fraction of the Danish museum's curiosities are on display. In full, the collection comprises millions of animals from around the globe, and boasts exemplars of several species that have become extinct in recent centuries, such as a well-preserved skull of a dodo, Raphus cucullatus, as well as fossils of dinosaurs and other organisms from previous eras of the Earth's history. Here, in this old and venerable museum, it is easy to detect the ideas that lay behind the collecting of natural objects for the past 3.5 centuries. The need was perceived to educate the populace of nations, whose empires extended around the world, about the progression of time and about their place in the expanding universe. Collections demonstrate the might and extent of empire and the value of research. All things can be named, catalogued, and systematically categorized. In our current era, the Anthropocene, or human age, is such an approach still valid? In our time, the natural habitat of the planet has been radically refashioned by humans. Vital links between species, developed over eons, have been swiftly severed, fundamentally impoverishing the living world and posing a serious threat of the mass extinction of many species. How, I wonder, can such a process possibly be catalogued or categorized, given the speed of change and the complexities involved? And what would be the point? As I walked to the museum in Copenhagen, I observed gulls flying overhead, their raucous cries drowning out the noise of the city, as if they were asking me to take their greetings to the taxidermied birds inside. Another day in downtown Copenhagen, I encountered a crowd of young people who were loudly marching, brandishing placards with the slogans of a new international movement, Extinction Rebellion. Most noticeable were the placards that read, "There is no Planet B." For decades, the great auk had held the place of honor in what was then Copenhagen's Zoological Museum, ornithologist and former collections manager Jan Bolling Christensen told me. In his office was a life-size great auk made of plastic, wearing sunglasses and a necktie, as if to indicate that it was part of the museum's staff. In the 1980s, Christensen made a visit to Iceland, sailing past Elte, where the birds, whose viscera are preserved in the museum's great glass jars, had once laid and incubated their beautiful eggs. Christensen showed me the museum's old logo. It depicted a great auk. Sadly, the logo was replaced following the reorganization of the natural history collections in Copenhagen. The great auk was no longer regarded as being representative of the several museums and their diverse fields. Before, when the Zoological Museum celebrated its foundation day, the public had been invited to come and see the logo's inspiration for themselves. Hundreds of people would walk around the taxidermied great auk, that fearless-looking bird with the great beak. They would think about it and put questions to the staff. Birds that no longer exist had, and still have, a special attraction. They have much to teach us. The Gairfowl Books. I never saw a great auk when growing up in Iceland, where they had once been quite common. What first brought my serious attention to the fate of the species and its continued relevance was Elizabeth Kolbert's 2014 book, The Sixth Extinction, which has a chapter on the original penguin. I was also struck by a 2018 article by Petra Tschitske-Kalshofen, piecing together the extinct great auk, which cited in some detail a group of intriguing manuscripts known as the Gairfowl Books, describing an expedition to Iceland by the 19th century British naturalists John Wolley and Alfred Newton, Gairfowl being an old name for the great auk. Kolbert mentioned these manuscripts, I realized. So did Errol Fuller and Jeremy Gaskell in their books on the great auk from 1999 and 2000. Last, a 2013 article by historian of science Henry M. Coles A Victorian Extinction, drew my attention to the Victorian concerns with evolution and animal protection that informed Alfred Newton's groundbreaking work on the concept of extinction. Like their contemporaries, Wolley and Newton busily collected birds' eggs and specimens, classifying and recording them in the fashion of the Victorian age. When they set off for Iceland in 1858, they hoped to visit Eldey and study the rare great auk. They hoped to observe the bird's behavior and habits, and perhaps bring home an egg, or a skin, or a stuffed bird or two for their own cabinets of curiosities, unaware of the fact that the species had already been hunted to extinction. When they left Victorian England for Iceland, they teased that this was a genuinely awkward expedition. And so it proved to be, in many ways. They never made it to Eldey. Like me, they never saw a great auk on Iceland, not even stuffed. Prior to the killing of the last great auks, extinction was either seen as an impossibility or trivialized as a natural thing. The great taxonomist Carl von Linné, or Linnaeus, 1707 to 1778, imagined that a living species could never disappear. For evolutionary theorist Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, species would naturally come and go in the long history of life. The great auk brought home the fact that a species could perish quite quickly, and moreover not naturally, but primarily as a result of human activities. No other extinction had been documented as carefully. During their historic expedition to Iceland in 1858, Wolley and Newton collected impressions of great auk hunting, through substantial interviews with the men who took part in the latest hunts and the women who skinned and mounted the birds, along with their prices and sales on foreign markets to collectors of curiosities. These impressions were preserved in the set of 5 handwritten notebooks Wolley titled the Gairfowl Books. Now archived in Cambridge University Library in England, their hundreds of pages are written in several languages: English, Icelandic, Danish, and German. As an anthropologist and an Icelander, once I had seen the Gairfowl Books, there was no return. I had to dive into the text and visit zoological museums and archives, and to write this book. For me, the great auk opened wide an intellectual window into ideas of extinction and their relevance to the current mass disappearance of species. Now that I know the great auk's long history, I feel as if the stuffed birds in the Copenhagen Museum were once my neighbors or acquaintances. As a scientist, I know that their viscera are stored in alcohol to preserve them and to enable people to study them. But I wonder if the organs are in a constant state of inebriation from the alcohol, existing beyond the bounds of real time, in a sort of euphoric oblivion. Generations of visitors, of all ages and many nationalities, have passed by these jars of preserved bird parts over the past century and a half. What observations did they take home? The hearts, stored in one jar, are no longer beating, but no doubt many visitors on my side of the glass have wondered, as I do, how they would have pulsed when the bird's blood was still flowing, and whether they could be resuscitated by electric shock or genetic reconstruction. The eyes of the last male great auk are kept in another jar. I see them staring, gazing both into the past and into my own eyes. In the field. Bird watching was part of my childhood in Iceland. Is that why the fate of the great auk attracts me so? As a youngster, from the age of 10, I collected birds' eggs. Attending the cows in the meadows and passing through nearby wetlands gave me an opportunity to explore the rich and noisy, sometimes deafening, bird life during the peak of the nesting season. I found the lively birds a striking contrast to the lazy and stubborn cows. I blew out the contents of the eggs I found, and kept the unbroken ones cushioned in hay in a cardboard box. My largest was from a swan, Cygnus cygnus, nearly as big as the egg of the great auk. It's remarkable, I think, that the same term is applied to the music of the swans as to the final performance of a living being. A swan song, the metaphor based on the ancient folk belief that a swan's final song is its most beautiful. Perhaps my interest in the great auk began, instead, when I did anthropological field work in the Icelandic town of Sandgerði from 1979 to 1981, about 10 miles northwest of Keflavik International Airport. Wolley and Newton had worked in Sandgerði over 120 years earlier, interviewing some of the men and women who hunted, killed, and processed great auks. I was conducting a similar study, seeking information on skippers reputed to be good fishers. I remember walking from one farmhouse to another, and having long talks with men who knew the fishing grounds like the backs of their hands, and a younger generation of skippers who fished the same grounds under entirely different conditions, using sophisticated electronic equipment. I drank a lot of coffee, and there was some intensive smoking. Some days I would drive out of the town, past Keflavik International Airport, and all the way to the southern end of the peninsula, the Reykjanes toe, looking at old farmsteads and fishing stations, and striving to grasp what life had been like in the days of the rowing boat fishery. I had not known then about the 2 British scientists who rowed this way in 1858 to learn about the great auk hunts. When it dawns upon me that it is Sandgerði that directly connects me to the great auk expedition of 1858, I dig out the tape recordings I made during that field trip in 1979, a total of 10 tapes. I ask around for a machine that will play them, Sony UXS90, now a rarity, and sit down to listen. The sound quality is good, and my interview subjects express themselves clearly, but their voices seem to come from the distant past, speaking of a long-vanished world. The boat foremen explain what their role was, the importance of sitting in the proper place on board, how the boat was launched from the beach, how the fishing trips were carried out, what it meant to be a good fisher, and how shares of the value of the catch, or the catch itself, were divided among the crew. My informants sound like they were living in the Middle Ages. During my first stay in Sandgerði in 1979, I was offered the opportunity to go out on a fishing boat, laying nets in the Reykjanes fishing grounds near Eldey, in the dangerous straits Wolley and Newton never ventured into, notorious for cross-currents and rough seas. One could not say no to such a challenge. The forecast was fine, but soon after we departed, the weather turned. When I came ashore, more than 24 hours later, head spinning and still wobbly on my legs, with a taste of vomit in my mouth, the humorists in the crew joked that I had given the birds plenty to feed on. As an anthropologist, I find it interesting now that the fishers used the recovery from seasickness, sjóveiki, metaphorically for the process of learning. I remember the pleasant feeling near the end of the fishing trip, as I regained my balance. I began enjoying the boat's movements, and could attune to the tasks at hand. This is referred to as að sjóast in Icelandic, to become the sea, similar to but not quite the same as the English phrase finding one's sea legs. The Icelandic metaphor makes good sense to me. As we become skillful at our tasks, we are not simply internalizing mental scripts, what one needs to know in the conventional sense. More importantly, the bodily sensation of nausea gives way to skillful grounding. It's literally a gut reaction. As we immerse ourselves in our activities, engaging with the immediate context of learning, we begin to feel at home in both our bodies and in the world. In the evenings, during my field seasons in Sandgerði, I would make notes of what I had learned about the battle of these people who go out and catch fish. My notebook proved useful later, although it is a small one. I am filled with admiration for Wolley and Newton, who had nothing to rely on but pencil, pen, and paper. Unlike them, I had a camera and a tape recorder, and the benefit of being a fisherman's son and a native speaker of Icelandic. I benefited, too, from a brand-new electronic gadget fishermen would call the Spy. It automatically searched for dialogues at sea on the interboat radio, allowing the field worker and skippers to pick up endless gossip about fishing places, gear, weather, and personalities. Sometimes complicated codes and euphemisms were used, given the competitive nature of fishing. These I needed to translate and interpret. I recorded hours of such dialogues, and they became an extremely valuable source of anthropological insights, somewhat like the Geirfowl books for Wolley and Newton. My father, who was born in East Iceland, became one of my informants. I was surprised to learn that he had begun his fishing career on a small motorboat at Sandgerði in 1939, at the age of 17. My mother was relieved when he quit fishing. He decided to take a job in a fish plant when I was born 10 years later. I was their second child in just 1 year. I can understand her apprehensions. My maternal grandfather was the foreman of an open rowing boat in the early 20th century. For as long as I can remember, a large photograph hung on the living room wall at home, showing his boat and crew on their way out to fish. The men were posed between the thwarts in their oilskins. They look serious. Their safety at sea could never be taken for granted. The boat had no motor, only oars, and the nearest landing place on the mainland was far away. The south shore of Iceland is an endless expanse of sands, with hardly any harbors or safe havens, often whipped by crashing surf. In my father's time, the end of the fishing season was May 11th, when accounts were settled and fishers moved on to other tasks. The choice of date adapted to fish migrations, ecological cycles, and social life. Fishing stocks were seen then as an infinite resource and were open to all, with minor limitations regarding breeding grounds, as long as one had a boat and a crew. Before long, though, the fish populations began to decline. Cod, the main species fished around Iceland, might not have become extinct, but catches were unreliable. A couple of years after my field work, in 1983, the Icelandic Parliament decided to launch a quota system, radically redefining fishing. It was now the responsibility of humans to prevent collapses of fish populations. Soon, the ocean would come to be seen as the ultimate aquarium, inviting fundamental questions of inside versus outside, the observer and the observed. Much the same questions as were raised in the 19th century by the extinction of the great auk. Historic sites. At some points, while writing this book, I have felt the need to mentally relive Wolley and Newton's journey through visiting the key Icelandic sites. One autumn day in 2018, for example, I go back to Sandgerði, the place that, above all, links me to their quest for the great auk. Having located the remains of the old cottage from which the town receives its name, I drive 10 miles south past the airport to Kirkjuvor to see the manor house where the two British naturalists lived. The cluster of buildings that stood there in 1858 are gone. I knock at the door of a modern house that stands about where I think the old farmhouse was located, and am told with a smile, perhaps they are used to the question, that the present residents know nothing of the great auk hunters. The buildings on the farmstead of Kotvors, closer to the sea, are half collapsed. The ruins of the turf structures that Wolley and Newton visited are scattered around, and the impressive local cemetery recalls that this was an important and busy place in the 19th century. I try to identify the landing place where the foreman recited the fisher's prayer before launching the boat in search of great auks, and where the British visitors clung to the hope of getting out to sea themselves and reaching the island of Elte. Although the weather never lifted, and they never landed on the island to learn for themselves that the Gairfowl was gone. A little farther south, I decide to look for the cairn that Wolley had built, a dry stone cone of rocks, probably to serve as a landmark, and a monument to their expedition. I follow the trail that he and Newton must have taken along the cliffs. It takes me considerable driving and walking to reach their observation point. Over the centuries, this coastline has seen serious erosion due to high seas. One of the worst floods recorded occurred in the middle of a January night in 1799, ruining an entire hamlet. One woman drowned, and many boats were shattered. A nearby church was blown away. Equipped with Wolley's drawing, depicting the cairn with Elte in the distance, I finally find the spot, about 5 miles south of Kirkjuvor, where the grassland meets the ocean. Wolley's drawing is clearly accurate, giving a good idea of the contours of the landscape. I can sense his excitement as he built his cairn, Elte over his shoulder as he worked. But the cairn itself, Wolley's monument, is gone. I continue south along the coast to the westernmost point of the peninsula. Here stands a tall statue of a great auk by U.S. artist Todd McGrain, part of his Lost Bird project, memorials of extinctions at historical sites. It was installed by permission of the landowners, descendants of a man who had rowed out to Elte on one of the last hunting trips. The sculpture is a pleasant surprise. A proud bird, about my height, gazing mournfully out to sea. Putting my arm around the bird, I look out in the same direction, and catch a glimpse of Elte through the drizzle. The waves crash on the cliffs, like a reminder of those old expeditions to the island that had such a fateful impact on the lives of both birds and humans, and on the modern framing of Extinction. Chapter 1. The Road to Extinction. In 1858, when John Wolley and Alfred Newton set off from Britain on their expedition to Iceland, the great auk, Pinguinus impennis, was reported to be in serious decline. Wolley's friend, William Proctor, keeper of the bird collection at Durham University, had traveled to Iceland in 1833 and 1837. Partly in order to seek out great auks. Proctor told Wolley that sightings were now rare in Iceland, and that he had not seen any of the birds. Wolley's fellow student, William Milner, who went to Iceland some years later, inquired about great auks on his travels, and was informed that none had been seen recently, though 2 had been caught 2 years earlier in 1844. Milner's account of his visit gave rise to a strong suspicion that the species was not only rare, but vanishing. Wolley took a keen interest in discussions of rare birds, and he resolved to go to Iceland with the same intention as his friends. He invited Alfred Newton, then making a name for himself as a zoologist at Cambridge University, to join him. Wolley and Newton met for the first time in Cambridge one October day in 1851, although they had corresponded for several years. Wolley had recently passed his final examinations in medicine at the University of Edinburgh with excellent results.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?